No mistake about it. After all those years in the real estate and construction business, the new president of the United States has a particular penchant for building stuff. First order of business, building a wall at the border, which Mexico insists won't be paying for it. Perhaps not up front, but that wall could soon come with stiffer tariffs for imported goods. Donald Trump, seen here Tuesday at the White House in the company of auto executives, has threatened car makers who import models that could otherwise be made in the USA. His building plans go way beyond the border. Trump justifying the greenlighting of the controversial Keystone pipeline project as a job creation scheme. Environmentalists beg to differ. But while Democrats have roasted him for dismantling environmental protection, they've picked up the mantle on the president's plans to spend big on infrastructure, unveiling their own $1 trillion plan to rebuild crumbling roads, tunnels, and bridges. Could the Democrats and the American trade unions become Trump's allies against a Republican Party which for decades has been working to cut spending and downsize the role of the state? The question thus begs, is Trump really a Republican? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what could be seen as Trump's gamble. And with us from Washington, she's a former foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain, Republican political strategist Dana White. Nice to see you, Dana. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Happy
New Year as well to Dan Mitchell, who worked for former Senator Bob Packwood, now senior fellow at the Cato Institute. And joining us here in the studio, Francesco Saracino. Fine. Joining us here in the studio, Francesco Saracino, senior economist at the OFCE. How would you translate it? The French Office of
Economic Conditions.
Economic Conditions. Okay, there you go. The France 24 debate, where you could join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. The hashtag F24debate. Dana White, Donald Trump, in an interview with the television channel ABC, says, yes, he is going to be building that wall, and Mexico will, quote, completely pay for it. What's your reaction?
Well, I think Donald Trump sometimes has a propensity for hyperbole, but there's a great deal of money that the United States, that some people have talked about in terms of law enforcement. And if that money perhaps were cut off, that would effectively sort of take money that we would be giving to Mexico that we could redirect. There's also lots of other things. I mean, he's really talked about reimbursement, not as much as pay for. So I think we're going to have to watch and see.
The White House saying that the State Department will withhold visas and use other tools to ensure that countries accept back people who are in the U.S. illegally. What kind of a message does that send?
I think that it sends a message that he's quite serious about maintaining U.S. borders and ensuring a swift and a vetting of people who come into the United States. I mean, you've never had a president speak in this way or use these kinds of tools, and I think Donald Trump is going to do things completely differently than anyone in this town is used to it.
For their part, the Mexicans reviewing their options. Let's listen to what President Enrique Peña Nieto had to say back on Monday.
We will work for a border that unites us, not one that divides us. Even though Mexico recognizes the right of all nations, of every sovereign nation to guarantee its security, Mexico does not believe in walls. Our country believes in bridges.
Dan Mitchell, is Donald Trump unnecessarily picking a fight with Mexico?
Well, he definitely got a lot of political mileage out of it. The real question is, how far is he going to push it now? Will he somehow demand that there's a, say, a tax on remittances from Mexican Americans back to their families in Mexico? That's one way he could pay for the wall. Or is it just going to be a pork barrel spending program where Congress appropriates the money and there's no sense of cost-benefit analysis about whether it makes sense to build walls in certain parts of the border? So a lot of Republicans and conservatives and libertarians in Washington were looking at Trump, and we can't figure out what he really means, at least not yet.
Why this emphasis on Mexico?
I think Trump has used Mexico as a symbol of immigration, a symbol of trade. He's used it in a divisive manner, of course, and that probably explains some of his political success in some parts of the country. Those of us who want expanded trade and good relations hope that Trump doesn't go overboard in this area.
Francesco Saraceno, he's now the President of the United States. The campaign is over. How seriously do we take his statements?
Well, I think we should take all of them very seriously, because during the campaign people said he will never do that, and he will never do that was sort of the standard reaction to any of his announcements. And now in just a few days the first thing he did is sign an executive order to try to scale down Obamacare. So I mean, the wall is proceeding. Everybody said it's just a campaign promise. He will never do that. He seems to be going through it. So I mean, I think we should take that seriously.
Do you get a sense that even now Europeans are not taking him seriously enough?
I'm not even sure Americans are taking him seriously. Certainly not Europeans. There is some worry. I mean, there is a lot of uncertainty. I mean, you just have to read all the analysts who say, in principle, expectations for growth and forecast for growth is going up, but the variance and the amount of uncertainty surrounding the first steps of the administration is huge. So we are starting to take him seriously, but there is too much uncertainty still.
Too much uncertainty still. The U.S. president, who has made most of his meetings during this first week about jobs, he's been rolling back a lot of Obama administration policies. Let's listen to how he couched it when he talked about the rejuvenation of those contentious pipeline projects.
From now on, we're going to start making pipeline in the United States. We build it in the United States. We build the pipelines. We want to build the pipe. Going to put a lot of workers, a lot of steel workers back to work.
Francesco Saraceno, how many jobs out of pipelines does he expect to get? Is this a...
Honestly, how many out of pipelines, I don't know. The question I would ask is how many jobs are there to be created? Let's not forget that the American recovery has been there for a while, and the labor market is becoming tighter and tighter. So the risk is that he will push the economy up to a point where it starts overheating.
Push the economy to a point where it starts overheating. Dana White, this is a bit counterintuitive what we're seeing from the new president. Right now, unemployment is low, growth is high, stimulus, and the likes of which we talked about at the outset. Usually that's for when the economy isn't running well.
I think what Donald Trump really captured is you do have the lowest historical rate of labor participation. And I think he's captured that even though the numbers may look good, that unemployment is low, I think a lot of Americans don't feel it. And I think Donald Trump has really tapped into that secret sauce that I think Ronald Reagan did that really changes how people feel about tomorrow. They feel safer. They feel like things will get better. And I think people underestimate him at their own peril. I think when you're talking about 1,000 jobs, like the 1,000 jobs he saved at Carrier, I mean, those mean a lot to those 1,000 people. So I think sometimes in the Washington bubble of statistics, people do forget that those are real people and real families, that if it's one more person who has a steel job, I mean, he met with the unions yesterday, then that's a good thing for American workers.
Francesco Saraceno?
Well, it's true that there is a difference between unemployment and participation.
Because right now the unemployment rate is 4.7%.
The unemployment is very low, and the standard argument is yes, because lots of people got out of the labor force, so the participation is also lower than usual. But this is also an issue on which we have to be very careful, because we don't know how much of that decline in participation is structural and how much of it is cyclical. And if there is a big chunk of it which is structural, it's not by closing borders or by inducing firms more or less in a nice way to hire.
Explain that difference, the difference between structural and cyclical for our viewers.
Population is aging.
Right.
So there are people getting out of the labor force simply because it's the natural way of life. The period of study of people lasts longer. So the span of life that people spend in the labor force is getting shorter, and so on and so forth. There are a number of things linked to the demographics and to the aging of the population that are slowly making participation decrease. This is true for the United States, it's true for other countries. On top of that, there are what I think Trump is trying to address, which are the issues of the so-called discouraged workers, workers who would like to work, who would like to be in the labor force, and they are not in there. Bob Gordon, who's fine, he's certainly not in the Washington bubble, he's a Northwestern professor, estimates that these people are much less numerous than people would believe.
That there's fewer people who
are discouraged, who are out of the labor force in spite of wanting to work.
All right, so Dan Mitchell, what are your thoughts? Is it Donald Trump or is it the statistics that are out of touch?
Well, there's no question Donald Trump seems to have a very clever political instinct, a lot more cunning about what resonates with people than I would have thought a year ago and what most people would have thought. I mean, heck, he got elected and nobody expected that. But on this issue of the economy and jobs, if you look at the labor force participation, it's not really older workers that have dropped out, it's younger workers. And I don't know that a lot of it is because people are extending their studies, or maybe they're extending their studies just because the job market hasn't been that strong. So I'm all in favor of the right kind of stimulus, but we have to define that. If we mean by stimulus what Obama did in 2009, where the government wastes a bunch of money and you don't get anything good out of it, that I'm not in favor of. On the other hand, if what Trump is doing is saying, I'm going to get government out of the way, I'm going to give permits for the private sector to build pipelines, I'm going to lower the corporate tax rate so there's more incentive to create jobs, that's the good kind of stimulus. And so it's really critical to focus in on whether he's making government a bigger burden or is he getting government out of the way.
All right, which brings us to the heart of the matter. Dana White alluded to it a moment ago. Monday, the new president's first full business day in power began with a meeting with executives, and then Donald Trump met with leaders of construction industry unions, many of whom, Dan Mitchell, came out heaping praise on Trump. What do you think of that?
Well, the union movement in the United States is really two different bodies. You have the government workers who don't really have much of an incentive for there to be a strong private sector. They don't care. They have these sort of guaranteed, very well-paid government jobs. But private sector unions have been shrinking over time, in part just because the economy during the Obama years has been relatively stagnant, only 2% growth, which is way lower than what we're used to in the United States. And what Trump is telling these union bosses is, we're going to get the private economy growing again. You have a stake in that. And if Trump can do that successfully, and this is where he has this political cunning that none of us gave him credit for, he could actually take those blue-collar workers, those union workers, out of the Democratic camp and put them in the Republican camp simply by telling them, my policies will create good private sector jobs.
And is he right?
I think he's absolutely right. I think Donald Trump has really rewritten the playbook for everyone.
Dan Mitchell?
I'm still agnostic on that issue, because if Trump goes ahead with some $1 trillion government infrastructure plan, that's sort of the same policy Obama had. It didn't work for Obama. That's the same kind of Keynesian stimulus that Japan has tried for the last 25 years. It hasn't worked. So that part of Trump I don't like. On the other hand, if Trump says we're going to cut the corporate tax rate to 15%, we're going to cut a lot of wasteful spending, we're going to allow, get the EPA from over-regulating the private businesses so much, then I do like that. But at this point in time, I have no idea which Donald Trump we're going to see. Maybe we'll see both of them. So it'll be a roller coaster. I'll be happy one day and then sad the next day.
Dana White, do you agree with Donald Trump that the government should be spending big on rebuilding roads and bridges and the such?
Well, I will say I agree with Dan from the standpoint is we have to wait and see. I think Donald Trump understands big projects. He's a builder. He understands it. He's from Queens, so he understands the unions. And so I think he's in a really unique space to actually make a infrastructure project work. Because Dan is right. If it's just going to be another Obama stimulus that wasn't so shovel-ready, then that's a problem. But I think if one person could do it, it's probably this president.
Francesca Saracino, how is this going to change the conversation on this continent? You remember you've come on the show many times saying, why isn't there more stimulus here in Europe? Why isn't there more stimulus? Are Europeans going to follow his lead now? And we talked about these big infrastructure plans at the European Union level. So far, they haven't really delivered, have they?
No, well, there are a number of things I would like to say. First of all, claiming that the Obama stimulus didn't work is kind of far-stretched. The American economy has been growing much more than other similar economies since 2009, thanks to the stimulus. And the stimulus was also scaled down substantially because of, of the confrontation between Obama and Congress starting from 2012. So there has not been this huge stimulus that people talk about. So first of all, I would be cautious in saying that the Obama stimulus didn't work. In my opinion, it worked pretty well, especially compared to what we saw in Europe. Second, it
was more ambitious.
It was more ambition. It had to go to political compromises. And I mean, there was a confrontation, the sequester, I don't know how to pronounce that, story with the Congress blocking the budget in 2012, I think. So I mean, it was not an easy political climate, and in spite of that, the American economy managed to recover much faster than the European economies. So that is the first thing I would like to say. The second is, it is true that there's a choice of how you make stimulus, and the trade-off is there. Should we do more infrastructure, so more spending, or less taxes? And this is where we go back to what we were saying before about employment. The risk is that if you increase employment, but you also reduce social security, for example, you don't dispel this sense of precariousness that is probably more than jobs the issue with American workers.
We have to take a very quick break. We'll be right back. You're watching the France 24 debate.